Hey, Dr. Bill Sinyard here with Gospel App Ministries, gospel-app.com, and Gospel Rant Podcast. Hey, thanks for listening. And look, if you benefit from the show, please pass it on and follow it or like it. You know, I regularly load up special programs, and if you follow or like, you'll be notified. All right, to this show. We're going through the book of Hebrews. It's so unique, and for the most part, poorly covered by most pulpits. And why? Well, you're going to find out again in this show. We're going to be talking about God-ordained persecution. I mean, who wants to believe that? We Jesus followers are supposed to follow in the sandals of Jesus, who did all of those amazing good things for other people, other-oriented, and yet he was still persecuted. That's the blueprint, right? That's the template. It seems that the author of Hebrews knew that persecution was coming for his listeners, and it's not plan B, it's plan A. I mean, did you know that according to Open Doors, 365 million Christians suffer high levels of persecution and discrimination for their faith? 1 in 7 Christians are persecuted worldwide, officially. Almost 5,000 were killed for faith-related reasons last year. Almost 15,000 churches and Christian properties were attacked. If Hebrews is right, it's coming here, and it's for the higher good of the kingdom. To put it another way, persecution ordained by God is a gift from God for his children that he loves. You see why Hebrews has got to been avoided? And because it sounds very strange, right? And I'm not saying that I like the plan. I don't. Just say it. So here's a headline. If you're not being persecuted for your faith and haven't, and your love for the unloved and the unlovable and the unlovely, I mean, the implication is that something's wrong. I'll say more. Welcome to God's love for the unlovable. So persecution is one of the biggest themes, if not the biggest theme in the entire book. Maybe close to Jesus is better than, fill in the blank. And it's the one topic I think that most of us would rather not talk about. Persecution is intentionally inevitable for Christians. And to not follow Jesus into persecution is the pinnacle, for Hebrews, the pinnacle of sin and disobedience. Faithlessness. Now, just to be sure that I'm not misquoted, it's not about losing your salvation. But unfaithfulness in this area can rob you and me of my present experience of eternal salvation. I am a son of God, but I can feel like an orphan sometimes, miserable, right? So your Christian walk this side of heaven includes programmed, produced, and directed by Jesus persecution to one degree or another. That necessarily leads, in the hands of God, to an experience of glory and honor for you eventually as a co-redeemer, right, little r, or an active participant, it might be better said, in the salvation and rescue of others somehow. And though often it's just not clear to us in the middle of persecution and suffering what good it is, but in heaven we'll see. There is a way that we can be more ready and prepared for persecution and suffering. That's the point of Hebrews. And the author will say, beware, be afraid that you're not found ill-prepared when suffering comes. All right, here's another way of thinking about it. God loves us so much and wants the best for us. Okay? And normally you would think that would be heaven, right? Wouldn't that make sense? Heaven's going to be great. Well, apparently not, because the better thing for you, obviously, if you're listening to this, is to leave you here instead of taking you to heaven right now. Why? One of the reasons is you're offered the opportunity to participate in the rescue and salvation of others, and often through high cost for you. And that's your highest path of glory and honor, walking in the footsteps of Christ, your highest calling. Does that make sense a little bit? So, and God's committed to that. He's committed to keeping you in the game. Otherwise, he would just take you home. And maybe this show is just part of that invitation for you. If you want comfort, if you want security, if you don't want to be bothered, maybe you shouldn't listen to the rest of this show. So, look, we begin our faith journey with such enthusiasm. God, take me where you want me. I'll do anything for you, Jesus. I'm so grateful. But we're humans and we drift. And if we drift too much unaware, we're just not going to be found faithful when we get that challenge from God. And suffering is a spectrum, right? 0 to 10. Shortly after becoming a Christian, I was honored to be in the wedding of one of my closest friends growing up, and it was a real thrill. And at the bachelor party, the entertainment was such, I won't go into it, that I just couldn't, in good faith as a baby Christian, participate in it. No judgment. I just couldn't. So I quietly went to my friend and got him alone and apologized that I couldn't stay, and I had become a Christian, and you get the idea. I didn't preach at him. I didn't criticize him or judge him. But, I put him in an awkward position, I guess, and I think, that's why he made such a big public deal of it for the rest of the guys. And I ended leaving in great ridicule and shame. It hurt, I'm telling you. Later, by the way, I heard this was the moment that he began the process of becoming a Christian. So my persecution partly led to Jesus' salvation for him, his experience of that, where I participated to a little degree. I was one of the puzzle pieces for his salvation. And you probably have stories as well. The author of Hebrews seems to simplistically argue that this is why we're still here. It's supposed to be an honor, but sometimes through cost, right? And by the way, I'm not suggesting that was high suffering or high cost. So many more of you have suffered, and me too, so much more than that. It was just a story, right? Suffering for Jesus' followers leads you to being crowned eventually with glory and honor. That's chapter 2, verse 9. Your faith becomes enhanced. You begin to think of others more. That's righteousness, right? You think of their well-being over your own. And you are being made perfect, meaning consecrated for this task. That's chapter 11, 35 to 40. And I think that means the same thing as righteousness. You become more other-oriented a little bit. The structured persecution actually shifts you from thinking about yourself to others more, a little bit more like Christ. Your faith, your hope grows. You begin to experience this heavenly sourced faith of the Spirit more. So it's God testing you, chapter 11, verse 17. It's the will of God, chapter 10, verse 36. It leads to more obedience and compliance, chapter 5, verse 8. It can lead to salvation for others, 2, verse 9, 12, 11, 13, verse 12. It increases your spiritual endurance, 12, verse 7. And the end of persecution is a harvest of righteousness, which means the well-being of others and peace for others. So be encouraged. We endure the race marked out for us. That's chapter 12, verse 1. And it's marked out for us by God. And we run by the word of Jesus and by the power of his Spirit. Like I said, it's a theme in Hebrews. And again, in an earlier show, the biggest sin in Hebrews is not adultery or lying, right? All those are big. The biggest sin that the author of Hebrews talks about seems to be not enduring in this God-ordained persecution, looking away, falling away. Chapter 12, verse 1 is a good reference. Sin, then, is refusing. Unbelief is refusing him who speaks, chapter 12, verse 25. And he's not saying to go and look for persecution. That would be pretty foolish, right? It's coming because God loves you and me too much to withhold that discipline and persecution. He's left you here for that glorious purpose. That's his plan. Hebrews' very narrow view of transgression and disobedience, then, is all about not being faithful to God's calling, hesitating and following him into some areas that might be dangerous or lost for you, all because of fear. Like Israel didn't enter the promised land due to fear. We also must not follow their example. The children of God suffered discipline versus joy. They didn't have the rest. They didn't have the glory. And the Septuagint, by the way, disobedience, parakon, in chapter 2, verse 2, is often mentioned as the unwillingness to listen to God. And so that disobedience received its just punishment. They didn't enter God's rest in the wilderness. All right, I'm going to say more in the future show about rest, but this rest that Hebrews talks about is not what you might think. The promised land that they were going to go into, God's rest, was filled with very powerful people who fought to keep their land. So when you cross the Jordan to enter God's rest, it raised the bar to even more need to trust God for years. Entering God's rest was most likely a syntam. That means the same thing as take up your cross. You need to walk in the Spirit, Paul. You need to follow Jesus even through the valley of the shadow of death, Psalms. It's just not a Sealy Posturepedic. Yeah? So Hebrews is concerned that listeners, that's us, concerned that we weren't ready mentally or emotionally or spiritually to follow when persecution came, and because it's God's plan, it's coming. So he gives them lots of warnings to not follow in the footsteps of their predecessors in the wilderness wanderings. So here's some verses, chapter 3, verse 12 to 4:13, 5:11 to 6:12, 10:19 to 39, 12:14 to 29. It's everywhere. Per commentator Lane, the listener's temptation then and today was to disregard the seriousness of the Christian commitment, with the result that some were in danger of drifting off course. Their interest in the Christian message had significantly slackened. That's understated. They were neglecting the Christian message to protect their own security and well-being, thinking of themselves over others. Close quote. And again, we're not talking about losing your salvation if you don't enjoy persecution, but you lose the presence of peace and joy and hope, right? So look, heavy, so I want to lighten it up a little bit, kind of tongue-in-cheek now. I'm going to give you some ideas that would help you get into some persecution. It would help you be persecuted. Look, I am not encouraging you to look for persecution. I'm just going to give you a couple of ideas that it's out there. And if we just stood our ground a little bit graciously, we'd be picked on. And that's an understatement. So here we go. If you started to say, in polite conversation, graciously, I believe that the power of the gospel is big enough today to reconcile Israel and the Palestinians. And by the way, including Hamas, Hezbollah, the gospel's that powerful. It seems innocuous to say, but look, don't try to say it unless you like getting stink eye from even well-meaning Christians. Chances are you're going to hear what I've heard when I've said this, the tired old mantra, well, conflict is prophesied in the Bible, right? Meaning, well, there's just nothing we can do about it. Yeah, biblically, that's partly right, but conflict is not the only thing prophesied. Healing, rescue, and reconciling is also prophesied. Check out Isaiah 19, verse 19 and following, where God promises that he's going to make Assyria, think Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, throw in Palestine, Hamas, Hezbollah for good measure, Egypt and Israel. He's going to call them all my people. That's 1925. So put that on a t-shirt, and I suspect that you're going to be treated with some contempt all around. But we believe it, right? How big is our gospel, really? Or, again, politely say, I believe the power of the gospel is the only thing that can really defeat addiction. Fentanyl, heroin, oxy, marijuana, social media, porn, sexual addiction, right? I just finished a series, a 10-part series, Power to Change, on Gospel Rant podcast, saying that very thing. But do we really believe it? The gospel. How big is your gospel? If you say that, you will probably be portrayed as pretty naive, right? Here's another one. I believe, just say that, again, graciously, I believe the power of the gospel can and does rewire people's traumatized, fractured identities. Because what we're all longing for, right, since the fall of humanity, is to have our cups filled with the fullness of God. Ephesians 3:14 to 21. Or a little earlier in that section, to experience the height and width and length and depth of the love of Christ. Everything else is a substitute, right? To be embraced by God. It's in our wiring. To be desired, to feel desired by God again. It's in our DNA. Well, what difference would it make in our world? Think of the person with a poor body image, overweight, underweight, too tall, too short, skin issues. Or better, think sexuality struggles. Can God fill the identity cups of people who are sincerely wanting to feel desirable, desired, loved, and respected? I mean, you will most likely be persecuted on the one side by people who feel like you're being insensitive and have a very narrow view of sexuality. You might even be homophobic, you could be accused. On the other side are the well-meaning Christians who just demand that we just need to call sin a sin. So is your gospel powerful enough to heal identities and identity traumas? Yeah. I believe that the gospel is powerful enough to begin to make those who feel unlovable now, for whatever reason, those who feel undesirable, unwanted, broken, feel like they're in the wrong skin or wrong sex. I think the gospel, this relationship with God, can actually make them feel lovely and desirable as they are. And until they feel that gospel thing, they're going to need to have cups filled by just about anything, anywhere. And most of it, gives you a dopamine hit for the moment and a little bit of hope, but then, it leads to addiction and depression. But try saying that out loud today. And I'm not talking about being angry, I'm just saying, say it. How about this? The power of the gospel can make perpetrators, bad men and women, the really bad guys and gals, the gospel can make them filled with godly sorrow, 2 Corinthians, and can make them truly repentant. Make them. Our justice system just sucks at that. But try saying that and working towards that end. Well, this can begin to crack racism, street violence, gangs, the anger we're seeing in our country. How about the abortion issue? Oh man, we can't talk about that, right? I believe, and just say this graciously, that the power of the gospel can actually make a distressed pregnant mom who's distressed for whatever reason, to make her feel a strange new love, a miraculous, unlikely love for her unborn, right now, unwanted child, baby, can make her believe that it's actually a human being, right? And that love could happen where it wasn't there before, there was only fear. And the gospel can displace the fear, right? There's perfect love that casts out fear. It can defeat shame and insecurities that she might be feeling, right? It's complicated. Legislation can't generate that kind of thing. It just can't. Supreme Court or no. Or it could make that poor woman, whatever she's going through, and it's huge things going on, right? We need to respect that, can make her feel that God actually loves her and has her back. It's the miracle of the gospel. The gospel can also begin to powerfully heal the trauma of rape and incest if that was involved. Nothing else can. The gospel can give rape victims the power to truly experience both justice and eventual forgiveness, an honorable forgiveness. So check out Forgiving Path, right? Forgivingpath.com. It's helped over 1,000 Christians experience justice and forgiveness, many of them rape victims. The gospel can do it. Do we believe it? The power of the gospel can reconcile even the worst to God and to each other. So parents and children, victims and perpetrators, Muslims and Jews, Democrats and Republicans, well, maybe we'll see. If we started really, really believing this and saying it graciously, can you imagine how people would look at you? It might be awkward and a bit uncomfortable, How about immigration? Big deal right now, right? Biggest issue in the race for president. Do we believe that the love of God, God's power, might just be bringing all of those people from all of those lands to us so that we can be Jesus' hands and feet, caring for them and telling them about Jesus and what Jesus has done for me? That we too are just migrants here this side of heaven. Or are we just entirely focused on changing government policy? I mean, let's work on that. But the big headlines, I think, for we Jesus followers is that so many tribes of the world are being brought to us by God's hands. Now, I'm not suggesting that none of them are saved. I'm not. But the gospel is all about rescuing the beat up. What if this is part of our suffering and persecution, right? Well, if you start saying that, you're going to be caricatured as a religious zealot for sure. So here's the last one. Have you heard, you're not going to like this, baby, there is no greater existential threat to humanity in our times than global warming. Christians, can we just politely suggest that while the environmental issues are very important, this is our home, we should be responsible, it's nowhere near the top of the list. The biggest existential threat in our time is the existential separation of most of humanity from God, and the selfishness that that engenders, the hopelessness, the fear, the depression. And it also causes Christians to drift so much so we begin to turn inward. If we're not experiencing that, it's the lack of the existential experience of the love of Jesus that loves the unlovable, the unloved, and the unlovely. And that vacuum leads to conflict. It leads to racism, a wide variety of suffering and greed and hoarding, as well as environmental abuse. Look, God's not going to allow the world to end until all's been accomplished. We either trust Him or not, Christian. What say you? This does not mean that we can treat the environment irresponsibly. We should really be leaning into it. It does mean that we don't need all of the fear and anxiety as if there were no God who was good and in control. Jesus controls everything by His word, Hebrews says. Yeah? All right. So what can you do to sharpen your experience of Jesus and get off the bench and back into the very dangerous and uncomfortable, rewarding game of persecution? Wow, I'm not sure I liked what I just said, but here's some ideas that might shake your life up, right? Have some fun with this. Number one, go on an annual mission trip, right? What are you saving the money for anyway? Pickleball? Look, go. Or two, sponsor your children or parents or neighbors to go on mission trips. Three, volunteer at a Christian inner city mission. Doesn't even have to be a Christian one. Go to shelters and food kitchens. 4, start talking to others about the unique love of God that innately loves the unlovable, the unloved and the unlovely, the unwanted, the victims, the perpetrators, that loves sinners. One of the most profound 3 words, God loves sinners. He loves the undesired and the undesirable. Just inject that into regular day-to-day conversations graciously. When somebody gossips about, that horrible person and what they did, say, I believe the gospel is big enough to rescue that person from their current behavior. They can experience the love of God. The power of the gospel can reconcile that person to God and to others. Yeah, and even to the one they hurt. Watch and see, you could say. You may not be invited into those conversations anymore, and that's okay. Congratulations. But you've spoken love to power, the gospel. 5, and this is fun, have a bunch of people over and watch The Chosen again, all of the seasons. The author of Hebrews says one of the things we can do to get ready is to OCD obsess over Jesus, His life, His words, His actions, who He spoke to, what He said, what He didn't say. I use The Chosen this way in premarital counseling to focus on Jesus. 6, and most importantly, regularly ask God for His power through the Spirit in your inner being so that you would begin to really experience Jesus' love for you and His love for those unlovables around you, around the world. That's Ephesians 3:14 and following. Ask God for the Spirit-sourced faith to do this. And then sit back and watch as persecution begins, as people look at you funny, as they leave you out of the typical political conversation, and that's okay, right? You're not alone. This is the rest, God's rest, that He has promised you. All right, we need to wrap this show up for now. I am writing a couple of very interesting books. The first is a new-gen teen Christian young adult fantasy for ages 10 to 15 called The Tale of the Unlikely Prince. It's in the same genre as C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. It's fun, it's quirky, it's thrilling, and it's a read about a prince who seeks an amazing quest from the king big enough that it would prove his worth and his enoughness to everyone, including himself. You see the struggles, right? But not all quests are alike, to be sure. And this king is just not what the unlikely prince imagined. In one way, it's the teachings of the book of Hebrews. Second project is a book on overlooked and underappreciated women in the Old Testament. It's it's lots of fun. Many of these great women have flown so far under the radar you may not remember their stories, but you will now. Their voice deserves to be told. If you want to know when either one of these books comes out, drop me a line, bill@gospel-app.com. If you've benefited from this YouTube show, please subscribe. It helps us out a lot. Thanks ahead of time. Pass the word along. You can also follow me on Instagram, Gospel App, one word. We will see you next time. Take heart, child of God.